Hello everyone, thank you for tuning in to watch my talk today. My name is Emiel Haeghebaert. I am an analyst with the cyber espionage analysis team at Mandiant Threat Intelligence, and I predominantly focus my research on Middle Eastern threat actors, more specifically those we believe to be operating from Iran. In this presentation, I will discuss UNC788, a cluster of threat activity that we believe conducts espionage operations, credential harvesting, and surveillance activity on behalf of the Iranian government. I will start with an introduction to Mandiant's UNC system, and follow this up with an overview of open source reporting on the group. Then I will jump into a walkthrough of my analysis on a domestic surveillance operation that we uncovered in March 2021. And as final part of my talk, we'll focus on the experience and analytical process uncovering this operation by stepping through the initial discovery of the malicious infrastructure. I will discuss the tools that I implemented to pivot to additional actor resources, and I will also, of course, explore the evidence that underpins our attribution assessment. So first off, what are ungroups? In December 2020, FireEye published a blog post detailing its use of ungroups, also referred to in full as uncategorized groups. This is a way of clustering and keeping track of threat activity clusters that aren't yet eligible to be classified as an APT or a fin group. And as the blog notes, UNCs are created around a defining, anchoring characteristic of threat activity. And as we discover new artifacts that are associated with other incidents and through proactive collection efforts, this UNC provides a framework for us to join discrete pieces of evidence together. So an UNC will typically include observables, right? So adversary infrastructure, tools, and tradecraft, right? And it can grow, merge with, or break off from other clusters as more data becomes available over time. When it comes to UNC788, FireEye analysts created this cluster in May 2017 to track a large group of credential harvesting domains. Over time, we created new UNCs that we suspected but at the time couldn't actually prove were part of the same sustained credential harvesting effort. By early 2021, however, we had merged 7 clusters with UNC788, resulting in a pretty large activity set that we believe first became operational in 2012. And the graphic that you see here is actually a screenshot from Mandiant Advantage, and this shows a timeline of when we merged various UNCs with UNC788. As you can see, a lot of this work happened in late 2020. Now that we've defined what an UNC is, I kind of want to touch on how this relates to other organizations' names for similar activity. So it's of course inherent in threat intelligence capabilities that clustering of activity doesn't align one-to-one in all cases to the names of that other researchers, vendors, or organizations decide to give to a certain set of activity. So as a result, we have a complex adversary and malware naming environment, and multiple names can refer to either the same activity, elements of the same activity, or simply a related operation, right? So the threat activity that we track as UNC788 largely corresponds to activity sets others have reported on as TA453, that's for Proofpoint, Phosphorus for Microsoft, and Charming Kitten by various others, such as Clear Sky Cybersecurity, Certfa Lab, and then there's also ITG18 for IBM X-Force. So a literature review, right? UNC788 operations have been well documented over the past several years, and I want to take some time here to talk through some notable reporting and findings from these open source reports, and hopefully this will help paint a picture of the type of activity UNC788 is known to conduct. One of the first public reports on the group dates to June 2015, when Clear Sky Cybersecurity, Clear Sky for short, published its report on Tamar Reservoir. This was an operation targeting approximately 500 individuals that were active in academia, security and defense, journalism, and human rights activism, mostly across the Middle East. Clear Sky further suggested that the campaign may have begun in mid-2014, and they followed this up in 2017 with a new report in which they named Charming Kitten as an Iranian cyber espionage group pursuing access to private email and Facebook accounts. And they contrasted this to the more typical cyber espionage activity where we see actors targeting or compromising larger organizations. Finally, this report linked the Tamar Reservoir activity to Charming Kitten as well. Then 2 years later, in 2019, September, Clear Sky reported that it had observed Charming Kitten targeting academic researchers, but also influential public figures across the world. And to do so, the group had used spear phishing messages. Interestingly, they were impersonating researchers and journalists, oftentimes inviting the victim to an event or encouraging the target to review their resume. And this type of activity that Clear Sky described is consistent with Microsoft's reporting on what they call phosphorus. In October 2019, the company stated that its security researchers had observed phosphorus, which they linked to the Iranian government, targeting accounts associated with a US presidential campaign, current and former US government officials, journalists, but also prominent Iranians living outside of Iran. And Microsoft noted that the group, while they were not technically sophisticated in their view, appeared highly motivated and willing to invest significant time and resources in its operations. And this blog post also came on the heels of Microsoft's filing of an official complaint in March 2019, a couple months before. In this complaint, they alleged that the defendants had established an internet-based cyber theft operation that they refer to as Phosphorus, and this allowed Microsoft to seize 99 domains used by the group. In a follow-on report in October 2019, Clear Sky researchers subsequently wrote that they assessed with a medium to high level of confidence that the aforementioned Microsoft blog and Clear Sky's reporting were indeed tracking the same activity. In this report, they further detailed Charming Kitten's most recent attack vectors, including spear phishing, impersonating social media websites and using these platforms to distribute malicious links as well, and finally also sending SMS messages directly to a target's cellular device. And the group remained highly active during 2020, with numerous news articles discussing UNC788's persistent operations, right, again, against high-level individuals, journalists, conference attendees, and political and human rights activists. So for one, in January 2020, CertFalab, or CertFa for short, published a report that detailed the investigation of phishing campaigns with the apparent objective to steal email account data and information on the victim's contacts. The group in this case used fake interview invitations, and also in one specific case impersonated a known New York Times reporter, right? This in a likely effort to entice the target to, for example, log into a fake Google page. And similar to the activity described in previous reporting, this time Charming Kitten also went after government institutions, think tanks, academic institutions, and interestingly, also organizations with ties to the Baha'i faith. Additional campaigns that were reported in 2020 targeted attendees at the Munich Security Conference, as well as an Iran analyst at the Atlantic Council. And notably, about halfway through 2020, researchers at IBM X-Force retrieved from an Open Directory server what appeared to be training demonstrations that the group had made, likely to show their junior team members how to handle hacked accounts, as they described it. And this discovery appears to at least to some extent, corroborate Microsoft's perception that the group is not particularly adept at operational security, right? And then in the early stages of the COVID-19 pandemic, a noticeable shift in the group's targeting patterns occurred. For the first time, UNC788 started pursuing public health, medical technology, as well as pharmaceutical information. According to a Reuters article, the actors started conducting credential harvesting operations against the personal email accounts of staff at the World Health Organization. In May 2020, open sources then reported that the group had targeted Gilead, a US drug maker at the time, working on treatments for COVID-19 as well. And interestingly, the group appeared interested in medical research beyond treatments or vaccines for COVID-19. Most recently, in a March 2021 report, Proofpoint stated that TA453 had launched a credential phishing campaign that targeted senior medical professionals. And interestingly, these professionals specialized in genetic, neurology, and oncology research in the United States and Israel. And for context, right, Iran suffers from rampant shortages of medical equipment and supplies and drugs, including for cancer treatments. And this is the case despite economic sanctions levied on the country explicitly not applying to medical devices or medicine. So these types of operations might indicate that the regime is perhaps starting renewed efforts to offset these challenges or pursuing different avenues to do so. And then finally, 2 additional reports were released between the time when I wrote the paper and when I prepared this presentation. And so the first is Proofpoint's report on what they called Operation Spoofed Scholar. In this case, TA453 masqueraded as British scholars to target individuals of intelligence interest to the Iranian government. And the second is the Black Hat Talk and the associated blog from researchers at IBM X-Force, who discussed their findings on ITG-18, including operational security errors and an Android implant they named Little Looter. This is in fact the very same implant which Mandiant tracks as PINEFLOWER that I will be discussing in some depth today. So at this point, you likely have a pretty good sense of the type of activity UNC788 is known to conduct. And so to summarize, UNC788 is a cluster of threat activity that we suspect conducts cyber espionage operations, particularly on behalf of the Iranian government. The group is characterized by credential theft operations against corporate and personal email accounts, and they have consistently targeted Western think tanks and academics, current and former government officials, members of the Iranian diaspora in the United Kingdom, Israel, the US, and then also high-profile individuals within Iran itself. And in 2020, we observed UNC788 targeting employees of pharmaceutical companies, this in the United States and United Kingdom, right? And this is in line with the public reporting that we just discussed. And we judged that this was a likely effort to obtain medical information in support of the COVID-19 and public health emergency response. So this suggests that the group might alter its operational focus as Iran's strategic priorities evolve over time. UNC788 has been operational since at least 2012 and likely evolved from the participants of Iranian hacktivist forums. And so, to go a little bit further, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC, and the Ministry of Intelligence have long conducted extensive domestic surveillance and espionage operations against its domestic populace and foreign targets of strategic intelligence value, right? And so we estimate that UNC788 in fact conducts cyber espionage operations on behalf of the IRGC, and this is based on targeting patterns that align with the IRGC's operational mandates and priorities. All right, so for the domestic surveillance operation in March 2021, we uncovered this activity that used a malicious Android application that we ended up dubbing PINEFLOWER. We detected the campaign during our routine monitoring for UNC788 infrastructure procurement, and the remainder of this presentation will discuss this discovery of the operation and our analysis of the PINEFLOWER malware. Okay, so let's start with our initial discovery of the infrastructure. So because the group is very active, our team conducts routine monitoring for newly procured UNC788 infrastructure that is configured in a way that's consistent with their historical domain registration patterns. During this type of routine monitoring in late February of 2021, we identified a domain display-monitor.site, and it resolved to the IP address 198.23.213.155 as well as 157. And also resolving to the former IP address a few weeks prior was the domain account-inbox.com, as you can see here summarized in Table 1. And then notably, the DNS start of authority entry for account-inbox.com was set to namiurasoki@gmail.com. And this is an email address we historically have observed in use by this threat actor to register malicious infrastructure. One of the malicious domains, in fact, youtube-videos.com, was registered in July 2017, and interestingly, mimicked the Telegram login page, right? Likely in an attempt to steal user credentials. And there's more information on this actually in a 2018 Cisco Talos blog as well. So the reuse of this email address for domain registration is again indicative of perhaps the actor's relatively low regard for operational security. So pivoting. The domain display-monitor.site in fact hosted content impersonating a legitimate flower shop based in North Carolina in the United States. And a scan of the domain that's available in VirusTotal also shows that links to the legitimate company's social media pages were hosted on this site, right? So this suggests that the actors have scraped the flower shop's website in an attempt to make the domain appear legitimate or benign. So we pivoted on the URLs, the social media URLs in VirusTotal, and this led us to another suspicious domain named developer-app.xyz. This, in fact, also matched UNC788's domain registration patterns. And the actor hosted the same scraped flower shop content on this domain, and we were able to verify this with a screenshot that's saved by domain tools. VirusTotal showed a file that communicated with this domain, developer-app.xyz, and this file was named whatsapp.apk. And at this point, considering the proximity in space of the two domains, display monitor and developer app, right? which both, or at least the latter, served as a command and control server for this newly identified APK. We were able to hypothesize that this implant, this APK file, might be operated by the same actor that had registered the two domains. So we observed the scraped flower shop content on the two malicious domains, and we therefore chose to dub the Android malware family PINEFLOWER. Right, and the screenshots here show that the APK file appeared to have two DEX files bundled within it. A quick look at the two DEX files reveals some interesting strings, particularly in the assets/classes.dex file, and the strings are pictured here at the top right. So in particular, the data underscore GSC 98647A3 string appeared rather unique. We found that a second DEX file also contained this string, suggesting that these two files might be related, even though the second APK file was actually submitted to VirusTotal in January 2018, about 2 to 3 years before this WhatsApp APK file. So the parent APK file of the second sample appeared to be spoofing Google services. They used Google services as a subject and issuer of the certificate, and also leveraged the Google services icon to make it appear legitimate. So at this point, we thought it plausible that at this stage, that the file submitted in 2018 might actually be an earlier version of the same implant that we will end up calling PINEFLOWER. And so the command and control server for the second implant, hardship-management.com, had in fact already been mentioned in a public blog. It's called Iran Cyber News, and it had an article titled Corrupt Kitten Exposed. And so Corrupt Kitten was the author's chosen name for an Android implant that, according to the blog, supports a full range of spying and device management capability. The blog contained a summary analysis of this Corrupt Kitten implant and an MD5 hash for a DEX file that allegedly used this hardshipmanagement.com CNC server. Notably, the author also included that the malware stored files that were ready for exfiltration in a directory named .data_GSC98647A3. All right, so this is a string that we'd identified in our PINEFLOWER samples. So at this point, given the overlaps in command and control and the unique string, it seemed likely that Corrupt Kitten and PINEFLOWER might be one and the same implant. So finally, by pivoting on known infrastructure that we'd identified up to this point, we found additional domains that might be related to UNC788 activity. Notably, the command and control server for developer app.xyz actually shared an SSL certificate with this IP address here, 79.137.3.102, that had also hosted developer app XYZ from August through December 2020. In turn, we saw shared domain resolution to this inbox account.info domain. And then from there, we could keep pivoting, and we also identified secure-team.xyz and device-monitor.xyz. Right, so these are the shared passive DNS records that we observed, and the timeline kind of adds up where all of these records are based, or at least based in time, from September through December or January, 3 to 4 months later. So while this infrastructure is suspicious and roughly matches UNC788's domain registration pattern, we weren't in fact able to definitively attribute these domains to the group at the time. And so we marked these as potentially related. Then finally, this figure provides a visual overview of our discovery and the pivots that I've discussed. There's the account inbox.com and the display monitor.site domains here at the bottom right. There's a start of authority email address that leads us to the historical UNC788 activity. And then we see here the flower shop content pivot to developer-app.xyz, our PINEFLOWER sample, the shared SSL certificate that leads us to suspected related activity. If this is hard to see on the slide, there's a larger version of this image in the white paper as well. Okay, in this section, I will describe the technical analysis that we conducted on PINEFLOWER. So we used a variety of tools, including the MOIS framework, an Android emulator built into Android Studio, and JODX GUI for code analysis. While our initial analysis was done statically and then followed by running PINEFLOWER in an emulator in MOIS, we've combined our findings here to describe the execution pattern of the malware. And of the two samples that we had available for analysis, we focused on the most recently submitted one, so the WhatsApp APK file. So using the emulator built into Android Studio, we ran WhatsApp.apk on several devices in order to observe its behavior. So when PINEFLOWER is installed, the malicious application masquerades as, you might guess it, WhatsApp, before hiding itself and running in the background. On devices that run Android 11, the user is actually prompted to accept various permissions, and the application remains visible from the main menu, as you can see in the screenshots here. On older devices, however, the user is not prompted to accept permissions. Instead, once the application is installed, it's hidden from the main menu while it continues running in the background, again, as you can see on screenshots. And then once the malware has successfully been installed on the device, it sends an initial beacon to the command and control server. PINEFLOWER first reads the decimal encoded command and control server that's hard-coded into malware, right? So it's shown at the top of the slide here. The array in this case decodes to developer app.xyz, so http:// developer app.xyz. And the beacon, which is sent to the command and control server through an HTTP post request, contains the information displayed here on the right. So a SHA-1 value of the hard-coded AES key, more on that later, as well as device information, network type, subtype, and a timestamp. And the device information, so for the DI parameter, this information is formatted into JSON, and specifically in the key value pairs displayed here on the left. So using Mobisev's dynamic analysis feature, we were able to capture an example beacon that contained device information of our emulator and intercepted this traffic, right? So the device information that's passed to the command and control server, right? So with the DI parameter, it's formatted into JSON, and we see the example here where we have &SK, so this is a plain text SHA-1 value of the hard-coded AES key, and then all of this device information down here, as well as the timestamp. So this is what this looks like. Once this initial beacon has been sent, PINEFLOWER waits for commands from the command control server, and it uses a local SQLite database to store queued commands, as well as results of tasks that were run by these commands. So when PINEFLOWER successfully executes one of its modules, right, following a command from the command and control server, it adds a new entry to the SQL database, and eventually the final SQLite database can also be uploaded to the command and control server. And in terms of supported commands, PINEFLOWER can receive and support a wide range of commands from the command and control server. Some notable commands include calls recorder, sound recorder, SMS inbox, picture take, right? So this suggests that the malware is capable of, you guessed it, recording calls, triggering sound recordings, taking pictures, but also exfiltrating SMS inboxes. And these tables here show the supported commands, and then the corresponding 16, or the first 16 characters of the corresponding SHA-1 value, which the malware will use in its process to name files for exfiltration. Right, and these files are stored in a directory that's hard-coded into the malware, and this is our .data_GSE986 and so on, right, this folder. And when PINEFLOWER writes a file to this folder, it generates a unique file name in the format that we've shown here on the slide. So for example, the green string here, right, this is the first 16 characters of the SHA-1 value for sound recorder, right? So as we saw on the previous slide, for sound recorder here at the bottom, right, we see that C2CC53, my apologies. So that's the corresponding SHA-1 value. And then the blue string there, the second one, right? This is the result of a randomly generated UUID with the dashes removed, and then finally the Unix timestamp in red, which in this example corresponds to December 3rd, 2020. Okay, so then staging and exfiltration, right, but in code view, this is a representation of the Java code for the file generation method that we just discussed. So we can see, for example, here, this line here, right, it grabs the first 16 characters of the variable a, which in itself calls another method that in fact returns the SHA-1 value of the command name. It then also generates the random UID and replaces the dashes with nothing, right? And then finally, it concatenates the two together. And then the first method here at the top is the full generation of the file name based on the return of various methods, right? So this also includes the Unix timestamp and then the complete.d extension that we saw in the previous slides. And so PINEFLOWER also uses a compression and encryption routine, right, in order to obfuscate files prior to exfiltration. And so this is similar to the hard-coded command and control server, right? So the encryption key and IV that are used for AES-128 CVC encryption are stored in a decimal encoded byte array that you can see on the right. So PINEFLOWER compresses data via gzip and then passes these key and IV parameters to a function that encrypts the data with AES-128 CVC. So you can see here that this F127D and F128E, that's the key IV pair. Finally, for each exfiltrated file, the malware then also appends a base64 encoded JSON object that contains the name of the original command, a Unix timestamp, and a Boolean data field to the file data. And so the first line here is an example of base64 encoded string that would be appended to an audio file, right? So base64 decoded, we see name sound recorder, a Unix timestamp date, and the data Boolean set to false. But our analysis actually showed that PINEFLOWER would not use the compression and encryption routine, at least not on every file that it prepared for exfiltration. Rather, some files were in fact simply saved with the .complete.d format that we saw a few slides back, and then contain this base64 encoded string, as shown above, appended to the content. So it's therefore likely that these files could simply be saved with the correct file extension, or just opened with the appropriate software for the file type. And the only difference that we observed between the two samples of PINEFLOWER here are in fact in the hard-coded key and IV combinations, right, for the encryption routine and their command and control servers. So finally, right, like I mentioned that Iran Cyber News, that blog listed an MD5 hash value for another DEX sample or another DEX file. We unfortunately were unable to retrieve the bytes for this sample, but the blog's description does match our analysis of PINEFLOWER, right? So as a summary, right, the Android manifest file in the APK contains many more permissions that it requests from the target device. But the most important capabilities that PINEFLOWER ends up with once successfully installed, right, are listed here. So it can survey installed apps. It can grab call logs, record calls. It can see stored contacts, but also SMS inboxes, drafts, outboxes, files. It can upload, download, delete files. It can grab live screen recordings. It can toggle your settings, take pictures, and so on. So as discussed in the literature review section, UNC788 has long targeted members of the Iranian diaspora, but also dissidents and other individuals of interest, right, to the Iranian regime. And you might guess that this campaign is in fact no exception. Our analysis confirmed that the actors exfiltrated recorded phone calls, as well as room audio recordings, pictures, and entire SMS inboxes, along with relevant metadata from a number of devices that appeared to belong to individuals that were residing in Iran at the time. And interestingly, at least one device that we observed belonged to an individual who appears to be engaged in social activism in Iran and might have ties to individuals engaging with the Green movement in Iran. And so for us, this activity confirms long-standing suspicions that UNC788 conducts domestically focused operations as part of their ostensible mandate to conduct cyber espionage and credential harvesting operations, again, in support of Iranian strategic priorities. So in conclusion, the use of Android malware that to target individuals of interest to the Iranian government, right? This provides UNC788 with a very productive method of obtaining sensitive information on their targets, right? So including movement, context of interest, personal information. Further, the malware's ability to record phone calls, activate the microphone, record audio, exfiltrate images, take pictures on command, read text messages, and also track the victim's GPS location, right, in real time. All of these things pose a real-world risk to the individual victims of this campaign. And so, while UNC788 carries out frequent credential harvesting operations, right, using pages spoofing various login portals. We've now also confirmed that a subset of its operations target mobile device users. The group clearly has access to an expansive toolset, so we deem it likely that they have additional mobile malware tools at their disposal, and that the PINEFLOWER samples we observed are but a few of many. And with that, I included a slide with references to the work I have cited. These will also be in my white paper available for you to view. And that's all. Thank you.